Marcus Chen had always believed that small towns were supposed to be safe havens, places where neighbors looked out for each other, and the most dangerous thing you might encounter was a speeding pickup truck on Main Street. That belief shattered on a Tuesday morning in October when he received a frantic call from his sister Emma, who lived 3 towns over in Millbrook. Her voice was barely recognizable through the static and panic as she screamed about people attacking each other in the streets, about her neighbors acting like wild animals, about something spreading faster than anyone could understand. The line went dead before Marcus could ask any questions, leaving him staring at his phone in his small apartment above the hardware store he managed in Cedar Falls. The first reports came through social media and emergency broadcasts within hours. What started as isolated incidents of extreme violence in major cities quickly spread to surrounding areas. The authorities called it a viral outbreak, something that affected brain function and made people extremely aggressive. Marcus watched the news coverage with growing dread as reporters struggled to explain scenes of chaos that looked more like something from a horror movie than real life. The infected, as they were being called, showed no recognition of family or friends, attacking anyone within reach with a ferocity that defied human nature. By evening, the president had declared a state of national emergency, and by midnight, Cedar Falls had lost all communication with the outside world. Marcus spent that first night barricaded in his apartment, listening to the sounds of his quiet town transforming into something unrecognizable. The familiar voices of his neighbors were replaced by inhuman growls and screams that echoed through the empty streets. From his second-floor window, he watched Mrs. Patterson from the bakery stumble down Main Street, her floral apron torn and stained with something dark, her movements jerky and wrong. When she turned toward his building, Marcus saw that her kind eyes had become clouded and vacant, her mouth hanging open as if she had forgotten how to close it. He stayed away from the window after that, but the sounds continued through the night, breaking glass, splintering wood, and worst of all, the occasional human cry that would suddenly cut off into silence. By dawn, Marcus knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. His food supply was limited, and more importantly, he kept thinking about Emma and whether she had survived whatever had happened in Millbrook. He also thought about the other survivors who might be trapped in their homes throughout Cedar Falls, waiting for someone to take charge or at least figure out what came next. Marcus had never considered himself a leader, but his years managing the hardware store had taught him to think practically about problems and find solutions with whatever resources were available. If there were others like him, people who had managed to avoid infection and were now struggling to survive, they would need to work together. His first priority was securing supplies and finding other survivors. The hardware store beneath his apartment was a goldmine of useful items, tools, rope, batteries, first aid supplies, and most importantly, weapons. Marcus had always been uncomfortable with the hunting knives and camping gear that some customers preferred, but now these items represented the difference between life and death. He spent the morning quietly moving supplies upstairs, trying not to make any noise that might attract the infected who wandered the streets below. Through careful observation from his window, he noticed that the infected seemed to be drawn to sound and movement, but they appeared to have difficulty with complex tasks like opening doors or climbing stairs. As the day progressed, Marcus began to hear signs of other survivors. A radio transmission on an emergency frequency revealed that a small group had taken shelter in the town's elementary school, believing the brick building and limited entrances would provide better security than residential homes. The voice belonged to Janet Morrison, the school principal, who had been working late when the outbreak began and had managed to secure the building before any infected could get inside. She reported that several teachers and a handful of parents who had been at a school board meeting were with her, along with 2 children whose parents hadn't been able to reach them before the chaos started. Marcus made the decision to reach out to Janet's group, but he knew that moving through town would be extremely dangerous. The infected seemed to be everywhere, and while they moved slowly and appeared to have limited intelligence, they were relentless in their pursuit of any living person they detected. He spent hours planning a route to the school, studying the streets from his window and noting the patterns of movement among the infected. The hardware store's loading dock faced an alley that seemed relatively clear, and from there he could make his way through backyards and side streets to avoid the main roads where most of the infected seemed to congregate. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than staying isolated and hoping for rescue that might never come. Marcus waited until the late afternoon sun created long shadows that might provide some cover for his journey to the elementary school. He had packed a backpack with essential supplies: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, a crowbar, and a hunting knife he had never imagined using on anything more threatening than cardboard boxes. The weight of the pack felt reassuring, but his hands shook as he prepared to leave the relative safety of his apartment. Before opening the door to the stairwell, he pressed his ear against the wood and listened carefully for any sounds that might indicate infected had found their way into the building. The silence was almost as unsettling as the chaos had been, broken only by the distant moans and shuffling footsteps that had become the soundtrack of his transformed town. The alley behind the hardware store was littered with overturned garbage cans and debris from the panic of the previous night, but Marcus could see no immediate threats. He moved carefully, staying close to the walls and pausing frequently to listen for any signs of danger. The infected seemed to have poor hearing unless sounds were quite loud, but he wasn't willing to test that theory unless absolutely necessary. Each step felt like it echoed too loudly in the unnatural quiet, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. The familiar streets of Cedar Falls had become an alien landscape where every corner could conceal death. His route took him through the backyard of the Hendersons, a retired couple who had always kept their property immaculately maintained. The neat flower beds and trimmed hedges now seemed surreal against the backdrop of civilization's collapse. Marcus found their back door standing open, moving slowly in the breeze, and he couldn't help but wonder what had happened to them. Had they fled when the outbreak began, or had they become part of the infected masses now wandering the streets? He forced himself not to look through the open doorway as he passed, focusing instead on reaching the next yard and getting closer to the school. The elementary school came into view as Marcus crept through the playground of the neighboring daycare center. The familiar brick building looked like a fortress with its windows boarded up and no signs of movement visible from the outside. For a terrifying moment, Marcus wondered if Janet's group had already been overrun, if he had risked everything to reach a building full of infected. Then he noticed the subtle signs that someone was still alive inside, a small gap in one of the boarded windows that could serve as an observation post, and more importantly, the complete absence of infected around the building's perimeter. If the school had been compromised, there would likely be infected still lingering in the area, drawn by whatever violence had occurred. Marcus approached the main entrance carefully, noting that the heavy doors had been barricaded with what appeared to be desks and filing cabinets. He remembered Janet mentioning on the radio that they would be monitoring the emergency frequency, so he pulled out the small handheld radio he had taken from the hardware store and tuned to the channel they had agreed upon. His voice felt too loud in the oppressive silence as he whispered his location and requested entry. The response came quickly, Janet's voice telling him to wait while they cleared the barricade, and warning him that they would need to move fast once the door opened. The next few minutes felt like hours as Marcus crouched beside the entrance, scanning the empty parking lot and street beyond for any signs of infected drawn by the radio transmission. When the door finally opened, hands reached out to pull him inside before he could even see who was helping him. The door slammed shut immediately, and Marcus found himself in the school's main hallway, surrounded by 6 adults and 2 children who looked at him with a mixture of relief and desperate hope. Janet Morrison looked exhausted but determined, her usually neat hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and her professional clothes replaced by practical jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. The group quickly re-established their barricades while Janet brought Marcus up to speed on their situation. They had been surviving on water from the school's fountains and whatever food had been stored in the teacher's lounge and cafeteria, but their supplies were running dangerously low. More concerning was their complete isolation. The radio had picked up a few scattered transmissions from other survivor groups, but most communication had ceased within the first 24 hours of the outbreak. They had no idea how widespread the infection was, whether government forces were mounting any kind of response, or if they were truly on their own in a world that had fundamentally changed overnight. The 2 children, 8-year-old Tyler and 10-year-old Maya, had been remarkably resilient considering the circumstances. Their parents had been attending the school board meeting when the outbreak began, and both had been lost in the initial chaos when infected broke into the meeting room. The surviving adults had managed to get the children to safety, but the trauma of losing their parents and being trapped in the school was evident in their quiet behavior and the way they stayed close to the teachers who had become their protectors. Marcus felt a surge of determination as he looked at these two kids who depended on the adults around them to somehow make sense of an impossible situation. The next morning brought the harsh reality of their limited options into sharp focus. Marcus had spent the night learning about the group's resources and challenges, and the picture wasn't encouraging. Besides Janet, the survivors included two teachers, Robert Kim, who taught 5th grade, and Lisa Chen, a kindergarten teacher, along with 3 parents who had been at the school board meeting: David Walsh, a local mechanic, Patricia Hendricks, a nurse at the county hospital, and Michael Torres, who worked construction. Each person brought valuable skills, but they were still just 8 adults and 2 children facing a world overrun by infected. Patricia's medical background had proven invaluable in treating minor injuries and understanding what little information they had gathered about the infection. From her observations and the limited radio reports they had intercepted, she believed the outbreak was caused by some kind of pathogen that affected brain function, creating an aggressive state similar to rabies but spreading much faster and affecting victims almost immediately. The infected retained basic motor functions but lost higher reasoning, becoming driven purely by the need to attack and potentially spread the infection to others. Most disturbing was her theory that the infection was transmitted through bites or other fluid contact, meaning that any encounter with the infected carried the risk of joining their ranks. David's mechanical skills had been crucial in reinforcing their defenses and maintaining the equipment they relied on for survival. He had managed to get the school's backup generator running, providing them with limited electricity for essential needs like communication and lighting. His practical knowledge also helped them understand which tools and supplies would be most useful if they needed to venture outside or eventually relocate to a more sustainable location. Michael's construction experience complemented David's skills, and together they had turned the elementary school into a reasonably secure fortress. The teachers brought different but equally important abilities to their survival group. Robert had extensive camping and outdoor experience, making him their best resource for planning any expeditions outside the school. Lisa's background working with young children made her naturally suited to caring for Tyler and Maya, helping them process their trauma while maintaining some sense of normalcy in an abnormal situation. Janet's administrative experience proved valuable in organizing their resources and making the difficult decisions that leadership required. Marcus found himself naturally falling into a role as strategist and planner, using his practical problem-solving skills to think through their long-term survival needs. The hardware store had given him knowledge of tools and materials, but more importantly, it had taught him to anticipate problems and prepare solutions before they became critical. As he surveyed their situation, he identified several immediate concerns that would need to be addressed if they hoped to survive more than a few more days. Food was their most pressing issue. The school's cafeteria had provided enough supplies for several days, but they were now down to their last meals. Water wasn't an immediate concern since the school's plumbing was still functional, but they had no way of knowing how long municipal services would continue to operate. Power was dependent on their generator and a limited fuel supply that David estimated would last maybe another week if they were very careful with usage. Security was another major concern. While the school's brick construction and limited entrances made it defensible, they had already noticed infected gathering in larger groups, and their behavior seemed to be evolving. What had initially appeared to be random wandering was beginning to show signs of purpose, as if the infected were learning to coordinate their movements in response to stimuli. Patricia had observed this behavior change through their observation post and worried that their current defenses might not be adequate if the infected began working together more effectively. Communication remained sporadic, with only occasional radio transmissions from other survivor groups. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any official government response or military presence. If authorities were mounting rescue operations or establishing safe zones, no information was reaching Cedar Falls. This isolation meant that any long-term survival plan would need to be self-sufficient and assume that no outside help was coming. The psychological impact of their situation was also becoming apparent. While the adults were managing to function, the stress of constant vigilance and the knowledge that their old lives were gone forever was taking its toll. Tyler and Maya were showing signs of trauma that would require careful attention, and even the adults were struggling with depression and anxiety that threatened their ability to make rational decisions about survival. The decision to leave the school came after 5 days of dwindling supplies and increasingly aggressive behavior from the infected surrounding their location. Marcus had been monitoring the situation from their observation post when he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The infected were no longer just wandering randomly through the streets. They were gathering in groups, and those groups seemed to be drawn to the school with increasing persistence. What had started as occasional individuals shambling past had evolved into a growing crowd that pressed against their barricaded entrances with disturbing coordination. Patricia's nursing experience proved crucial in understanding what they were seeing. She had worked emergency room shifts and dealt with patients in various states of altered consciousness, and she recognized patterns in the infected behavior that suggested they were adapting to their environment. The initial chaos and random aggression was giving way to something more organized, as if whatever pathogen had affected their brains was continuing to evolve and change their capabilities. Most disturbing was her observation that the infected seemed to be communicating with each other through low moans and gestures, coordinating their movements in ways that suggested retained intelligence beneath their aggressive exterior. The breaking point came when the infected began systematically testing their defenses. Rather than simply pressing against the barricaded doors, they started working together to probe for weaknesses in their security. Marcus watched in horror as a group of infected used debris from the parking lot to build makeshift platforms, apparently attempting to reach the second-floor windows they had thought were safely out of reach. The sight of infected displaying problem-solving abilities shattered any remaining hope that they were dealing with mindless creatures driven purely by instinct. Janet called an emergency meeting to discuss their options, and the consensus was grimly unanimous: they needed to find a new location before the infected overcame their defenses. David had been monitoring radio frequencies and picked up a transmission from a group that claimed to have established a secure base at the old Riverside manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town. The facility was surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, had multiple buildings that could be fortified, and most importantly, was located away from the residential areas where most of the infected seemed to be concentrated. The logistics of moving their group safely across town seemed almost impossible. They would need to travel nearly 3 miles through streets that were crawling with infected, carrying essential supplies while protecting 2 children who had no experience with the kind of violence they might encounter. Marcus spent hours studying maps and planning routes that would minimize their exposure, but every path carried enormous risks. The main roads were completely impassable, clogged with abandoned vehicles and roaming groups of infected. Side streets offered better concealment but also more opportunities for ambush if they encountered infected in confined spaces. Robert's outdoor experience became invaluable in planning their escape route. He suggested moving at dawn when the infected seemed less active, using a combination of backyards, drainage ditches, and the old railroad tracks that ran along the edge of town. The route would be longer but would keep them away from the areas where infected were most concentrated. They would need to travel light, carrying only essential supplies and weapons, and be prepared to abandon anything that slowed them down if they encountered serious resistance. The night before their planned departure, Marcus found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. He stood at their observation post, watching the infected crowd that had gathered outside the school, and tried to process how completely his world had changed in just over a week. The people shuffling around in the parking lot had been his neighbors, customers from the hardware store, fellow members of a community that no longer existed. Mrs. Patterson was still among them, her bakery apron now torn and filthy, but her face retained enough human features that he could still recognize the woman who had brought him fresh bread every Sunday morning. The children were the hardest part of their situation to accept. Tyler and Maya had lost everything: their parents, their homes, their sense of security, and now they were depending on a group of adults who were barely managing to keep themselves alive. Marcus had never considered himself particularly good with children, but he found himself drawn to their resilience and their ability to find moments of normalcy even in their desperate circumstances. Tyler had found a chess set in one of the classrooms and had been teaching Maya to play, their quiet concentration providing a brief respite from the constant tension that surrounded them. As dawn approached, Marcus helped the others prepare for what might be their final attempt to find safety. They had decided to split into 2 groups to reduce the chances of losing everyone if they encountered a large group of infected. Janet would lead Tyler, Maya, and Lisa along the planned route, while Marcus would take David, Michael, Patricia, and Robert on a parallel path that would allow them to provide support if the first group ran into trouble. Both groups carried radios tuned to the same frequency, with predetermined signals for various situations they might encounter. The moment came too quickly and not soon enough. Marcus watched Janet's group slip out through the loading dock they had prepared as an emergency exit, disappearing into the pre-dawn shadows as they began their dangerous journey across town. His own group waited the agreed-upon 10 minutes before following, each person carrying a pack with survival essentials and weapons they hoped they wouldn't need to use. As they left the school that had sheltered them for almost a week, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking away from the last remnant of their old lives into an uncertain future that offered no guarantees except the promise of continued struggle. The journey through Cedar Falls revealed the true extent of devastation that had befallen their community. What Marcus had only glimpsed from the school's observation post was now spread before them in horrifying detail as they crept through backyards and along the abandoned railroad tracks. Houses stood with doors hanging open, their contents spilled into yards where desperate searches for supplies had ended abruptly. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of streets, some with doors still open as if their occupants had fled in panic, others showing signs of violence that painted a clear picture of what had happened to their drivers and passengers. The infected were everywhere, but their behavior patterns had become more predictable over the past week. They seemed to be less active during the early morning hours, moving more slowly and showing less aggressive response to distant sounds. This gave Marcus's group opportunities to observe them more closely, and what they saw was deeply unsettling. The infected retained enough human characteristics to be recognizable, but their movements had become more coordinated than the random shambling they had displayed initially. They seemed to be forming loose packs, following leaders who exhibited slightly more complex behavior patterns. Patricia pointed out that some of the infected appeared to be in better physical condition than others, suggesting that the progression of whatever had affected them wasn't uniform. Some stumbled along with the jerky, uncontrolled movements they had come to expect, while others moved with purpose and appeared to retain more of their original motor skills. This observation raised disturbing questions about whether the infection was still evolving, possibly creating different types of infected with varying capabilities and levels of threat. Their route took them past the hardware store where Marcus had lived and worked, and he couldn't resist a quick detour to gather additional supplies that might prove crucial for long-term survival. The building appeared undamaged from the outside, but when they carefully entered through the loading dock, they found that someone had already been there. The most valuable items, batteries, first aid supplies, camping gear, had been systematically removed, but whoever had taken them had been organized and careful, not engaging in the random destruction they had seen elsewhere. This discovery was both encouraging and concerning. It suggested that other survivors had been operating in the area, people who had managed to stay hidden and organized enough to conduct supply runs. However, it also meant that competition for resources was likely to become a major issue as more survivor groups encountered each other. Marcus made a mental note to be cautious about approaching other survivors, as desperation could make even well-intentioned people dangerous when essential supplies were at stake. The radio check with Janet's group came exactly on schedule, reporting that they had made good progress and encountered only scattered infected that they had been able to avoid. Tyler and Maya were handling the journey better than expected, though Maya had developed a persistent cough that Patricia was monitoring with concern. Lisa had proved to be remarkably capable in a crisis, helping to guide the children through difficult terrain while maintaining the quiet encouragement that kept their spirits up. As Marcus's group approached the industrial area where the Riverside manufacturing plant was located, they began to see signs that other survivors had indeed established some kind of presence in the area. The chain-link fencing around several facilities had been reinforced with additional barriers, and they could see evidence of recent construction activity. Most importantly, they spotted smoke rising from one of the buildings, indicating the presence of people who felt secure enough to risk the attention that fires might draw from infected or hostile survivors. The manufacturing plant itself was more impressive than Marcus had expected. The facility covered several acres and included multiple buildings of different sizes, connected by covered walkways that would provide protection from both weather and observation. The perimeter fencing was substantial, topped with razor wire and showing signs of recent reinforcement. Guard towers at the corners of the complex suggested that whoever was running this operation took security seriously and had the manpower to maintain constant surveillance. Their approach to the facility required extreme caution, as they had no way of knowing whether the survivors inside would welcome additional people or view them as threats competing for limited resources. Marcus decided to make contact using the emergency radio frequency, identifying himself and his group while requesting permission to approach. The response came within minutes, a woman's voice asking for details about their group size, weapons, and any signs of infection among their members. The conversation that followed was tense but professional. The voice identified herself as Commander Sarah Mitchell, a former Army logistics officer who had been visiting family in the area when the outbreak began. She had managed to gather a group of survivors and establish their base at the manufacturing plant, but she made it clear that admission wasn't automatic. They would need to submit to medical screening, surrender any weapons during the evaluation process, and prove that they could contribute to the group's survival before being offered permanent shelter. Marcus agreed to her conditions, recognizing that anyone who had successfully established a secure base in the midst of the chaos probably knew what they were doing. He coordinated with Janet's group to approach the facility's main gate simultaneously, ensuring that both groups would be evaluated together. As they gathered outside the reinforced entrance, Marcus couldn't help but feel a mixture of hope and apprehension about what they might find inside the complex. Commander Mitchell proved to be a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair pulled back in a military-style bun and eyes that seemed to catalog potential threats even during casual conversation. She met them at the gate with two other survivors, a man she introduced as Dr. James Harrison, who would conduct their medical screening, and Maria Santos, apparently her second-in-command who handled logistics and resource allocation. The screening process was thorough and professional, conducted in a decontamination area that had been set up just inside the main gate. Dr. Harrison's examination was comprehensive, checking not just for obvious signs of infection but also for any wounds that might have come from infected bites or scratches. He explained that their group had developed protocols based on observations of the infection's progression, and they couldn't afford to take chances with anyone who might be carrying the pathogen. Patricia was impressed by the medical setup they had established, noting that their equipment and procedures suggested access to significant medical supplies and someone with extensive healthcare experience. While the medical screening proceeded, Marcus had the opportunity to observe the organization that Mitchell had built within the manufacturing complex. The survivors moved with purpose and discipline, following established routines that suggested they had been working together for some time. Guard rotations were clearly defined, with sentries posted at strategic locations throughout the perimeter. Work details were organized efficiently, with people assigned to specific tasks like food preparation, equipment maintenance, and facility security. The most impressive aspect of their operation was the evidence of long-term planning. Rather than simply hunkering down and hoping for rescue, Mitchell's group had clearly committed to building a sustainable community that could survive indefinitely. They had established workshops for maintaining and manufacturing essential items, organized food production in greenhouse structures built against the south-facing walls of the main building, and even set up a school area where several children were receiving educational instruction from adults with teaching backgrounds. Tyler and Maya were immediately drawn to the other children in the complex, and Marcus watched with relief as they began to interact with kids their own age who had survived similar traumas. The resilience of children never ceased to amaze him, and seeing Tyler and Maya beginning to smile and play despite everything they had endured gave him hope that recovery and normalcy might still be possible, even in their transformed world. Janet was clearly impressed by the organizational structure she observed, and Marcus could see her mentally comparing their desperate flight from the school with the stability and security that Mitchell had achieved. The contrast was stark. While they had been barely surviving day to day, this group had built something that resembled a functioning community with clear leadership, defined roles, and sustainable systems for meeting their basic needs. Dr. Harrison completed his examinations and pronounced all members of their group free from infection, though he expressed concern about Maya's persistent cough and recommended continued monitoring. Commander Mitchell then conducted individual interviews with each adult, clearly assessing not just their skills and experience but also their psychological stability and willingness to follow the community's rules and leadership structure. Marcus found himself responding positively to Mitchell's direct, no-nonsense approach. Her questions were pointed and practical, focusing on what each person could contribute to the group's survival rather than dwelling on what they had lost or the trauma they had experienced. She seemed particularly interested in his hardware store experience and David's mechanical skills, noting that maintaining their equipment and facilities was crucial to their long-term success. The interview process revealed that Mitchell's group currently included 37 people, ranging in age from a 6-month-old baby to a 73-year-old retired engineer whose knowledge had proved invaluable in establishing their power and water systems. They had a diverse range of skills and backgrounds, but Mitchell emphasized that everyone was expected to contribute according to their abilities and that there was no room for anyone who couldn't or wouldn't pull their weight. After completing the interviews, Mitchell gathered their entire group for what she called their orientation briefing. She explained the community's rules, work assignments, and expectations in terms that were clear and unambiguous. Everyone would be assigned duties based on their skills and experience, with rotations designed to ensure that critical knowledge was shared among multiple people. Personal conflicts would be addressed through a council system, but Mitchell retained final authority over decisions affecting the community's security and survival. The housing arrangements were practical but comfortable, with families assigned private spaces while single adults shared accommodations designed to make efficient use of the available space. Marcus found himself assigned to share a converted office space with Robert and David, an arrangement that would allow them to continue working together on planning and logistics issues. The space was sparse but clean, with basic furniture and storage that represented luxury compared to their recent experience sleeping on classroom floors. Integration into Mitchell's community proved to be both easier and more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. The established routines and clear expectations provided a sense of stability that had been missing since the outbreak began, but adapting to life as part of a larger group required adjustments that sometimes felt uncomfortable. Privacy was limited, personal autonomy was restricted by community needs, and every decision seemed to involve consultation with multiple people who had their own opinions and priorities. Marcus found himself assigned to the logistics team, working with Maria Santos to manage inventory, plan supply runs, and coordinate the distribution of resources throughout the community. Maria had been a supply chain manager for a major retailer before the outbreak, and her organizational skills had been crucial in establishing the systems that kept their community functioning. She approached survival with the same methodical precision she had once applied to managing warehouse operations, tracking every item that came into or left their facility. The work was demanding but satisfying in ways that Marcus hadn't expected. After days of simply trying to stay alive, having the opportunity to contribute to something larger than immediate survival felt like a return to purpose and meaning. The logistics role also gave him insight into the broader challenges facing their community and the strategies that Mitchell's leadership team used to address them. Supply runs were the most dangerous but essential aspect of their operations. Teams of 4 to 6 people would venture out into the surrounding area to gather resources from abandoned stores, warehouses, and residential areas. These expeditions required careful planning, as the infected had continued to evolve and adapt, showing increased coordination and more aggressive responses to human activity. What had once been relatively predictable behavior patterns were becoming more complex and dangerous. David's mechanical skills had made him invaluable to the maintenance crew responsible for keeping their vehicles, generators, and other essential equipment operational. The manufacturing plant's machinery had been converted to produce items needed for survival, simple tools, weapons, and repair parts that couldn't be scavenged from the outside world. His ability to fabricate and repair equipment that would have been easily replaceable before the outbreak was now literally a matter of life and death for the community. Patricia's nursing background had earned her a position on the medical team working with Dr. Harrison to provide healthcare for the community's members. They had established a well-equipped infirmary in one of the plant's former office buildings, complete with supplies scavenged from local hospitals and medical facilities. The most challenging aspect of their medical operations was dealing with injuries that required surgical intervention, as they lacked both the equipment and sterile environment needed for complex procedures. Tyler and Maya had adapted to their new environment with the remarkable resilience that children seem to possess. The community's school program provided structure and normalcy while also teaching practical skills that might prove essential for survival. Along with traditional academic subjects, the children learned basic first aid, mechanical skills, and even rudimentary self-defense techniques appropriate for their age levels. Janet had been assigned to work with the education program, using her administrative experience to help organize classes and coordinate with the various adults who served as instructors. The challenge of maintaining educational standards while also preparing children for a world that might never return to normalcy required creativity and flexibility that drew on all of her professional experience. Robert's outdoor skills had made him a valuable member of the security team responsible for perimeter defense and scouting operations. The manufacturing plant's location provided natural advantages, but maintaining effective security required constant vigilance and regular patrols to monitor infected movement patterns in the surrounding area. His camping and hiking experience translated well to the fieldcraft needed for reconnaissance missions. Lisa continued her work with the younger children, but her role had expanded to include counseling and psychological support for community members dealing with trauma and stress. The isolation and constant threat of violence were taking their toll on everyone, and maintaining mental health was proving to be as important as physical security for the community's long-term survival. As weeks passed, Marcus began to understand the complexity of the social dynamics within their community. 37 people living in close quarters under constant stress inevitably led to conflicts and tensions that required careful management. Commander Mitchell's military background served her well in maintaining discipline and order, but she also demonstrated surprising sensitivity to the emotional needs of community members who were still processing the loss of their previous lives. The most challenging aspect of community life was the knowledge that their current situation might be permanent. Radio communications with other survivor groups had become increasingly rare, and there were no signs of organized government response or military rescue operations. Whatever had caused the outbreak appeared to have overwhelmed official response capabilities, leaving isolated communities like theirs to fend for themselves indefinitely. The first major crisis facing their expanded community came 6 weeks after Marcus and his group had joined Mitchell's operation. A supply run to the county hospital had gone wrong when the team encountered a large group of infected that displayed coordination and tactical awareness beyond anything they had previously observed. 2 team members were killed, and a third was severely injured, forcing the community to confront the reality that their survival strategies needed to evolve as quickly as the threats they faced. The debriefing session that followed was sobering and intense. The surviving team members reported that the infected had appeared to be waiting in ambush, suggesting a level of planning and forethought that challenged fundamental assumptions about their capabilities. Even more disturbing was the observation that some infected seemed to be directing others, issuing what appeared to be commands through gestures and vocalizations that other infected responded to immediately. Dr. Harrison's examination of the injured team member revealed bite wounds that were deeper and more precise than the random attacks they had seen in the early days of the outbreak. The infected appeared to be learning more effective ways to inflict damage, adapting their attack patterns based on experience with human prey. This evolution of tactics meant that their defensive strategies would need to become more sophisticated and flexible. Commander Mitchell called for a comprehensive review of their security protocols and operational procedures. The manufacturing plant's defenses had been adequate against the relatively disorganized infected they had faced initially, but these new developments suggested that their perimeter might not be sufficient against more coordinated attacks. The community would need to invest significantly more resources in defensive preparations, potentially at the expense of other essential activities. Marcus found himself assigned to a planning committee tasked with developing new strategies for supply acquisition and community defense. Working with Maria, David, and several long-term community members, he helped design protocols that assumed the infected would continue to evolve and adapt. The new procedures emphasized redundancy, with multiple fallback plans for every operation and cross-training to ensure that critical knowledge wasn't lost if key personnel were killed or injured. The psychological impact of losing community members was as challenging as the tactical implications. The two people who had died in the hospital ambush had been popular and respected members of the group, and their loss created a sense of vulnerability that affected everyone's morale. Children who had begun to feel secure in their new environment were once again confronted with the reality that the adults they depended on were not invulnerable. Tyler and Maya handled the crisis better than many of the adults, perhaps because their previous losses had already prepared them for the harsh realities of their new world. They continued to attend classes and participate in community activities, but Marcus noticed that they stayed closer to the adults they trusted and seemed more alert to potential dangers. The innocence of childhood was another casualty of the outbreak, replaced by a premature awareness of mortality and threat. The community's response to the crisis revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their social structure. Mitchell's leadership remained strong, and most people rallied around the need for increased security measures despite the personal sacrifices required. However, some community members began questioning whether their current location was sustainable if the infected continued to become more dangerous and organized. A faction led by Dr. Harrison advocated for relocating to a more defensible position, possibly a military installation or government facility that might offer better protection and resources. Another group, including Maria and several families with young children, preferred to strengthen their current defenses rather than risk the dangers involved in moving the entire community. The debate revealed underlying tensions about leadership, risk tolerance, and long-term survival strategy. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of being viewed as a neutral voice in the dispute, largely because his group had arrived relatively recently and wasn't identified with either faction. Both sides sought his support, recognizing that his practical experience and planning skills could be valuable in implementing whatever decision was ultimately made. The responsibility of potentially influencing the community's survival weighed heavily on him. The infected continued to evolve during the weeks of internal debate, with scouting reports indicating increasingly sophisticated behavior patterns. They appeared to be forming larger groups with more complex hierarchical structures, and their attacks on isolated buildings and vehicles showed evidence of tactical planning. Most concerning was the observation that they seemed to be actively searching for survivor communities, following trails and investigating locations that might harbor human populations. The decision point came when a massive group of infected, estimated at over 200 individuals, was spotted moving toward their area in what appeared